Hey, this is Jay Watts from Merely Human Ministries. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 6-ish.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Hey, this is Jay Watts from Merely Human Ministries. This is, I said 6-ish, Season 3, Episode 6-ish. Here's why. This is going to be a shorter episode because we're going to be recording another one next week as quickly as we can to discuss almost entirely the idea of the Republican Party removing from its national plank, from the platform, the idea of protecting abortion with a federal law. So we are going to be discussing that because that raises some huge issues. There are a lot of people who don't, in principle, like either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, and so their vote is a calculated effort to limit evil. That's what they're trying to do. They're not endorsing Donald Trump or any candidate for the Republican Party. What they're trying to do is to vote in such a way as it will limit evil within their community. And so questions come up, and here's what makes this question. This is why I want to talk about this as a subject matter that we focus on entirely, because one of the things a person once told me who was an executive director for the Republican Party over a state, he was a legislative director in another state, he had worked his entire life in the Republican Party at one point, he and I were chatting, and I asked him about votes, and he said, one thing that most people don't understand is that you don't vote for candidates, you vote to empower platforms. The Democratic platform, the Republican Party platform, when you vote, you're empowering that. And I want to give evidence that what he said is true, as we've seen in the abortion issue over the last couple of decades. And so I want to be able to have a conversation about that, because if you vote to limit evil, and if he's right, you're voting for the platform, not for the individual. Basically, your vote empowers the national platform. And even though you still have a large body of Republican candidates and Republican representatives and Republican senators who are principally pro-life individuals, the Republican Party no longer is in the way that it has been in the past. And if you're not if in the same way you could be critical, telling somebody that if you voted for the Democratic Party, you were empowering the platform. So even if somebody said, look, I'm a pro-life Democrat, it doesn't matter because you can't endorse the platform because it's explicitly pro-abortion. Now we have an interesting discussion that has to be had about what do we do as people who see no ability to endorse evil, but want to limit evil in our culture. How do we vote if we know that we're not empowering any platform that is on our side completely? And is it still legitimate to vote against the Democratic Party to put in power another party whose great claim is going to be we're completely apathetic to your views versus somebody who has complete hostility to your views? That's a question that is going to require more than just a few minutes. So that's going to be the next episode, and we'll be recording that really quickly on the heels of this one. So today we're going to have a short and sweet episode dedicated to two ideas. One of them less important to the pro-life movement. Now, if you followed me at all, then you know that I have a fascination with the rise of the animal kingdom and fighting back against America, or not America, against people, because some of this is going on in Europe. Not America, human beings. And I jokingly cover this because I love animals and I find all of this fascinating. So you might have thought, after what's been going on in Florida and this massive increase in shark attacks in Florida and closing the beaches, I remember my wife told me that for several days, 30A was closed. The water was closed at 30A because of the high number of sharks and because there had been shark attacks. And so this is unusual, right? I mean, now it's not unusual that sharks are in the Gulf of Mexico or sharks in the ocean, but the large amount of sharks that are starting to drift towards the shoreline and becoming a bit more of a problem than they have been in the past. But I am not interested in that today because something else I want to talk about. One of my favorite animals on earth are elephants. I love elephants. And I just recently heard something that I thought was absolutely amazing. There are so few animals in this world who have names for each other within their own animal language. And an article just appeared recently, and I heard about it on BBC News, and there's an article on NPR as well. that we will post up there. Okay. So where it discusses this idea that, and here's how, when we say names, it's easy for me to say the elephants have names for each other, like Jay and JD and Lisa, all the people in this room. Like we call each other by names to alert people that we're talking to them. We see the same thing, by the way, in dolphins, but differently. What dolphins will do is mimic the sound that another dolphin is making when they wish to address that dolphin. So they speak like that dolphin speaks, so to speak, and that gets the attention of that dolphin that they're being talked to or addressed. In some form or another, all we're looking for in developing patterns and analyzing the sounds that they make is that are there any sounds that they're making that when we run it through, and we're actually using AI and a learning program that can analyze it and figure out if there's any kind of repetitive sounds being made and if there's any response to those sounds if we make them back to the animals. And what we've noticed is that there appears to be names, sounds that they make that have, then when they're speaking directly to one elephant that responds to another. We were able to replicate these sounds, make them towards the elephants and get responses from them. And one sound, we get a particular response from a particular elephant. And so this is another thing, by the way, that's fascinating about elephants is that the level of the volume, not the volume, where they're talking is lower than we can actually hear oftentimes. And so we'll record it and listen to it. We need highly advanced listening devices. Why this is important to elephants is that they're oftentimes, I've read once, that we believe that they communicate through the ground so that they make noises that operate so low that they'll travel through the ground. They have very sensitive feet and that they can hear through the ground as well, which explains why they're capable of communicating over great distances. We've seen evidence of clear communication over great distances back many, many years ago when they used to cull back their herds more. And by culling them back, they would decide that the elephant populations in a particular area were getting really high. And so they would come in with helicopters and they would isolate a small group of elephants and kill them to reduce the numbers. That is horrifying. JD's yeah, it is horrifying. This makes it even worse, what I'm about to tell you, though, is that miles and miles away, while one group of elephants were being culled back, another group of elephants were getting emotionally disturbed and behaving in a way as if they knew it was happening. And the belief by the people that were studying them at the time was they were communicating through the ground and the other was receiving it. And then what happens, even more demonstration or more evidence of this, is that the next day, those other elephants come to the site where this happened as if to investigate what's happened or to mourn the loss of their friends. Elephants are weirdly emotional animals. And I've loved them for it. And so and this was my favorite detail. So it's fascinating that it appears that elephants have names. They think that it shows up the most in mother-child relationships. So they're learning their names from their mom and then they're carrying them on through their lifetime. And the last detail that I found so fascinating about this was that one of the scientists was being interviewed on BBC Radio, said that we sometimes hear them using the names of other elephants when talking to each other out of the presence of that elephant. But we know that that's the name, so to speak, of the elephant, which means they're talking about each other. They're not only talking to each other, but they're talking about each other. And I just find that fascinating. Okay. Was there anything else I wanted to cover before we get to the big thing today? That was a little thing. Let's get to the big thing. Let's get to the big thing. Okay, so I've been following, obviously, a lot that's going on with abortion over the last year in the news. And friends of mine send me articles. People that I work with, associates, send me articles to look at, to give thought to. And one of the things that a friend asked me to address with them was the question of the language of abortion. And this is where we've talked before about the term fetus, and that I don't worry about the terms fetus and embryo, as I think they're accurate. But here's the thing. There was an article that spurred this on. It was from the New York Times called Unborn Child or Fetus, Parsing Word Choices on Abortion in the Supreme Court. So when recently the Supreme Court decided that the doctors in Idaho are allowed to perform what would be considered under the law or discussion abortions in emergency cases, so that in emergency rooms, doctors don't have to worry that if they have to take action that causes the death of the unborn in order to preserve the life of the mother, in those emergency situations, that will not be considered something punishable under the law. So Idaho is free to perform abortions And some of the pushback from pro-lifers has been already. Some of them I've seen where they've said, look, when we're talking about saving the life of the mother, we're not talking about abortion. We're talking about a life-preserving action. It's not the intentional destruction of innocent human life. It's a life-preserving action that we know or foresee is going to cause the end of that life, but that we can't avoid in order to preserve. Because if we let her die, the child dies. So if we can't just let them both die, so we have to save her life, even if it means the end of the child, because we have to do the best that we can. What we talk about this is the confronting of natural evil. We've been given a situation where good is out the window. Now we've got to figure out what's the best we can do with the bad situation we've been confronted with. The best that we can do is preserve what life can be preserved. And in those cases where it's necessary to take action, like take a tubal ectopic pregnancy, that we can foresee will end the life of the child, it is morally allowed to do it, and it's not the intentional destruction of the child. It is the preserving of the life of the mother with the foreseeable end of that life that cannot be avoided unless we just want to risk both lives. So that the ISO case was decided by the Supreme Court. But the question that Kate Zernike for the New York Times on April 24th, 2024 wanted to talk about was the word choice used in pro-life literature by pro-life advocates, by judges. Samuel Alito used it in his court, the Dobbs decision. She says that they use the term unborn child. And she finds this reference to an unborn child problematic. Now, when I was asked about this, I was like, okay, here's the thing though. She's not the only one. I started to look up articles, and there were multiple articles for people that had the same problem. They have a problem with the idea of calling them unborn children. And so what I wanted to do is figure out why. Because if one person has a problem, I can reliably read their article and find out what their problem with it is. But then she does highlight the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Now, before I go, obstetricians and gynecologists. Now, before we go to that, I want to talk about, as I went through this process, the first place I went to was I found NPR. And NPR was talking about their language for abortion. And they were discussing why it's necessary to have standards in reporting about how they address abortion. Because NPR, now we all know NPR, if you've been following them at all, have been wrapped up in it, and they've been accused of being liberal and having an agenda. NPR claims that they don't, and they claim that they try to put in place things to make them sound as if they're not on one side or another as they write about something like abortion. And so they said, we're not going to use your terminology. We're going to use neutral terminology. And what they reject are labels like pro-life and pro-choice. People have read Randy Alcorn's books. I think Randy Alcorn has a book where he talks about this, where he talks about heaven. I can't remember the name of the book, but he talks about abortion in that book. I read it many years ago, and he says that it is journalistic practice in that book to refer to people as they want to be referred to. And so people contact NPR having heard these sorts of things and say, hey, NPR, we prefer to be called pro-life. It is your duty as a journalistic outlet to talk about us using the terms that we wish to be talked about, that's the practice of journalism. And so you can go to their website and find where they have printed the standards that they use to determine how they talk about the issue of abortion and why they don't use the terminology that you want them to use, or in their own case, they'll say either the pro-choice side wants them to use, or abortion advocates, or pro-abortion people. They say, we have used our language in such a way that we know this. We get complaints that NPR is using the language of the other side whenever the other side is depending on the affiliation of the letter writer, and thus giving the other side an advantage. An example: a recent letter from New Hampshire listener noted that NPR had referred to a pregnant woman as mother. He called that a politically loaded term. Imagine, let's just take a moment. Let's just take a moment and pray for the man or woman who heard somebody referenced as mother, a pregnant woman referenced as mother, and decided, egregious. I am going to rip off an angry email to NPR to object to it. It's politically loaded term. That's a loaded he. It's a he. Since a pregnant woman is not a mother until she gives birth. Wow. Okay, let's just let that lie for a second. Let's move on to what NPR is saying, or their justification for why they use in their policy. They say there are a number of principles that newsrooms at NPR included consider when crafting guidelines for the language used to discuss issues. The most important is to be factual. So they try to describe the situation as accurately as possible given the facts available at the time. Clarity, they're looking for clarity. There's also a desire to avoid language that has been politicized. And so the way that they use it, they say, we want to use action language. So they'll talk about abortion advocates. Why? Because that's what you do. You advocate for abortion. So they'll call pro-lifers anti-abortion advocates, which will upset some pro-life. By the way, I'm fine with that. I'm good, right? I'm maybe like, Jay, are you anti-abortion? Pretty much. Yeah, I don't have a problem with that, right? We may have to discuss some of the fringe issues to talk about what we mean when we're saying that. But at the end of the day, if you're just like, Jay, are you pro-life? Yes. Are you anti-abortion? Yes, I am. I don't like abortion. I think it's evil. I think it's wrong. I think it's the intentional destruction of innocent human life. I think it's destroying our offspring, the next generation of human life before they're born, almost entirely for reasons of convenience. Yes, I'm anti that. And if you call me anti-abortion, I'm all right. It really doesn't bother me that much. I mean, and so, but they're saying that you're an anti-abortion advocate because that's the opposite of the abortion advocate. And by the way, when I write articles for Christian Research Journal, I largely use the same standards. I will say pro-life advocates, and I sometimes I might throw in pro-choice. Very rarely, though. Most of the time, I refer to people who support abortion as abortion advocates, and I might call them, life advocates or something like that, something slightly more positive. But I really don't mind being known as being against abortion because it's accurate. It's an accurate description of me. I'm against abortion. I'm not on the fence about this. I believe that it's objectively wrong and that a good argument will demonstrate it, but I'm against it. So I'm anti it. So I'm good. But that's their reasoning for the language that they use. But I noticed the New York Times and other authors were going beyond that. And in that article that I mentioned, she does mention the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. So I found their guide to language and abortion. And why this is important, and I encourage you to go check it out. We'll have a link provided, but you can see it right there if you're watching. And if you're not watching, if you're listening, I got nothing for you on that one. So they say the language that we use when discussing reproductive health has a profound impact on what people hear and learn. Much of the language that is colloquially, much of the language is colloquially used to describe abortion or discuss health policies that impact abortion has a basis in anti-choice rhetoric and is inherently biased, inaccurate, and not medically appropriate, to say the least. Oh my gosh. So right out of the gate, we want to use, we're going to use clinically accurate when discussing abortion. We encourage people writing about reproductive to use language that is medically appropriate, clinically accurate, and this, look, get this. They actually say, we encourage people writing about reproductive health to use language that is medically appropriate, clinically accurate, and without bias. You got the nerve to write without bias 2 sentences after you referred to us as anti-choice rhetoric, right? Anti-abortion advocate, I'm fine with. Anti-choice, yeah, you went farther, a step further, further, to a degree further than what we've been talking about before. You cast your lot in on a side, inherently biased and not medically appropriate, to say the least. And then 2 sentences later, you're saying that this is clinically accurate and without bias. So we're going to examine that. Is the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists guidelines without bias? Because I'm just curious. I mean, obviously from the start, they got problems. So let's look at something from the beginning. Late-term abortion. This is what they call a term to avoid. Late-term abortion. This phrase has no clinical or medical significance. Term historically referred to the 3 weeks before or 2 weeks after a pregnancy's due date. To be even more clinically accurate, ACOG now refers to early term, 37 weeks through 38 weeks, and 6 days of gestation. Full term, 39 weeks 40 weeks and 6 days of gestation, late term, 41 weeks and 6 days of gestation, and post term, 42 weeks of gestation and beyond. Abortion does not happen during this period. So they're saying the term late term abortion, which is colloquially used to describe abortions later within the gestational period of that unborn child. Sorry if I triggered you, ACOG. Unborn child stand. So that unborn child, right? So they said, no. When we use the term, we're talking about the end. It has gone term. So we're talking in terms of the end of the term of the pregnancy. So it's either in that last days, early term, it's towards the end and early term, or it's full term, or it's late term, or post term. But we don't use term as a reference to those 3 weeks, or we don't use term as a reference to later in the course of pregnancy when the child is developed. So they're like, for ACOG, we don't use that term late term. They say to use instead abortion later in pregnancy or reference weeks of gestation, for example, abortion at 14 weeks of gestation. Okay, when we're talking about late term abortion, we're usually talking about 21, 22 weeks and after. Why 21 to 22 weeks or after? Well, because we have had children born at 21 weeks survive. 21, 22 weeks, we're entering viability. If we separate the mother from her child, separate the woman from the baby, then we have a shot at that child living. So when we're talking about late-term abortion, we're talking about abortions that are happening against human lives that could live or that could otherwise live. Now, I love their insistence that it just doesn't, and abortion does not happen during this period. It's not that it happens in the sense like we think that it's going on all the time. It was that under the Roe paradigm, it could. It was a constitutionally protected right that it could happen. Now, when Roe was decided and Doe was decided, this doesn't have to do with Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which shifted just to viability as opposed to the trimester system. But they said, look, in first trimester, the state has no right to interfere with abortion. The second trimester, state can have some compelling reason to interfere. The third trimester, states can interfere with the right to an abortion, except for, in Doe versus Bolton, they said, except for in the cases of health of the mother, and health was defined in broad terms, not just physical health or risk of dying, but things like financial or emotional health, things that didn't require there to be a direct threat to the life of the mother in order for a woman to be able to get an abortion in the third trimester. So when we use late-term abortion, that's what we're talking about. Sure, if you want to talk about abortion at 14 weeks of gestation, but I don't know anybody that talks about 14 weeks gestation as late-term abortion. So are they not biased or are they biased? Well, the example that they offer as the week, this is the weeks that we want to talk about, like 14 weeks. Don't say late term, say 14 weeks. Who the heck is talking about 14 as late term? That's not what we're talking about as late-term abortion. We're talking about 21, 22, and after, and they do happen. They happen much more rarely than early, but they do happen. Nobody was saying late-term abortion and meaning 38th, 39th week, although that was constitutionally protected and still is protected, by the way, in some states that do not recognize the fetus as a legal entity in any way whatsoever to be protected, like New York, who changed their laws after a weird car accident. We can talk about that some other time. So in the first time, I don't think you're really avoiding bias here. Chemical abortion. Don't use the term chemical abortion. They say this is a biased term designed to make medication abortion sound scarier than the safe, effective medical intervention that it is. By saying medical or chemical abortion, they're trying to, now, are you ingesting a chemical that will cause the unborn child within you, the fetal or embryonic life within you, to die and be expelled? Intentionally doing so for the purpose of destroying that life because you find the pregnancy either a problem or inconvenient? An abortion? So I get that they don't like the term because they think it's scary. But there are reasons, by the way, to not think that medical abortions are the greatest thing on earth. One of them is, and Abby Johnson has talked a lot about that, in her ministry, the practice of Planned Parenthood to just give them pills and send them on their way. They may go to a hotel or maybe go to their home, take the pills, and you'll be fine, and leave people alone to deal with what they're going to have to deal with. And oftentimes what they're dealing with is not what they expected, that they thought it was going to be an easy thing, and it was a painful and traumatic event that they had to deal with by themselves, including sometimes disposing of the unborn life that wouldn't simply flush down the toilet. Yeah, maybe the people that are trying to make it sound easier than it is are the people that are being a little bit disingenuous. Maybe you should be a little bit more reflective about what it is. And so if they say chemical abortion is biased because it sounds scary, and they say medication abortion, by the way, fine. As long as you preserve the word abortion in there, we're all clear about what we're talking about. If you want to get rid of chemical and put medication abortion, and we'll still talk about what happens during the course of a medication abortion, I'm good. It really doesn't bother me that much. We're still talking about abortion. Surgical abortion, the abortion procedure is not a surgery. Referring to it as a procedure is clinically accurate. Abortion procedure. Now, that's just people who are trying to differentiate between when a doctor is using instruments in an invasive manner to go inside through the woman's cervix into her uterus to act aggressively against a life in there, that we may want to discuss that as surgery or surgical abortion. But, they refer to that as it's not surgery. It's abortion procedure. This is where it gets interesting. Heartbeat bill. It is clinically inaccurate to use the word heartbeat to describe the sound that can be heard on ultrasound in very early pregnancy. In fact, there are no chambers of the heart developed at the early stage in pregnancy that these bills are used to target, so there is no recognizable heartbeat in quotation marks. What pregnant people may hear is the ultrasound machine translating electronic impulses that signify fetal cardiac activity into the sound that we recognize as a heartbeat. Fetal cardiac activity. What does that mean? Let's see if we can understand that. So I Googled cardiac. What does cardiac mean? So because I understand what the word fetal means and I understand what activity means. So I wanted to say, okay, what does the definition of just cardiac? What does cardiac mean? First definition that came up from Google, the only definition I got was having to do with or related to the heart. So they're like, don't you dare call it a heartbeat, Bill, because it's not a heartbeat. It's fetal activity having to do with the heart. And that's an important distinction. And their point is, if we understand the sound of a heartbeat when we're listening to an adult or more mature human being's heartbeat, what we're hearing is the valves closing and the chambers of the heart opening and closing. And so what you're hearing early at 6 weeks, if you can hear it that, 6 to 8 weeks is usually when you can start to hear it, isn't equal to that. If we're talking about valves, there are no valves there. But it is nascent cardiac activity. So the people that are saying you're hearing the heartbeat, they're saying, well, no, you're not hearing the heartbeat because that's not the same as hearing the valves opening and closing. Gotcha. But when you say it's fetal cardiac activity, you're saying fetal activity having to do with the heart, correct? So it's the early pulsing of what will ultimately become more complicated and sophisticated as a means of moving the blood through the body in order to oxygenate it and get it around your body, right? All through the system, which is starting. It's just not chambers yet. It's not valves yet, but it is the pulse that is pushing that stuff through. It's already starting to push fluid through. Fetal cardiac activity or fetal activity having to do with the heart. Why do they not like heartbeat, Bill? Because they want to call, and this is where you get interesting, because this is where you see this repeated over and over again. They say, use the term gestational age bands or identify gestational age, such as a 15-week band or a 6-week band. Let's take a moment and talk about 6-week bands, shall we? Because New York Times is all about 6-week bands in multiple articles. They want to talk about Georgia's 6-week ban, Texas's 6-week ban. They want to talk about Florida's 6-week ban. And they want to talk about it in light of this, what I'm about to tell you. 6-week bans are inherently unfair because it's 6-week gestational age. And gestational age begins at the beginning of the last menstrual period. So the gestational age at 6 weeks includes the 2 weeks of the release of the egg becoming fertilized, the zygote coming into existence, and it's traveling down through the fallopian tube into the uterus and then implanting into the wall, which sometimes takes 10 to 12 days. And when you get there is when it first starts to chemically communicate with the mother. So what they're saying is that a woman, it'll be 4 weeks gestation before a woman is even ready for her next period. And so if it's only 2 weeks after that, that is now illegal for her to get an abortion in states like Georgia, Florida, and Texas, she doesn't have time to even find out that she's pregnant so that she can get the abortion before the 6-week ban takes effect on her. And that's unfair. She'll just be finding out she's pregnant at best at the moment that a ban forbids her from being able to get an abortion. And they say that's unfair. Now, here's the weird thing to me, and this is why the ACOG language, I think, is their insistence on calling it a 6-week ban, because they refuse to call it a heartbeat bill, makes it more confusing. Language at its best, when being used by professionals, ought to be not just accurate, but it also ought to be clarifying. You ought to be helping people to understand what we're talking about. And when Georgia and Texas say they have a heartbeat law, that's exactly what they have. They don't have a 6-week ban. They have a heartbeat law. The Florida law is a little bit more, it does mention 6 weeks, but that's because it's defining itself versus an existing 15-week ban. And so it mentions 6 weeks, but it also references itself as a heartbeat law. So here's the difference between a 6-week ban, which is what they are angry about, and a heartbeat law. A heartbeat law recognizes from the moment they come into existence that nascent human life is one of us and due the same respect and obligations under the law that any other human being is due. So that if you want to have an abortion, it is the responsibility of them to determine whether or not you have a living being inside of you. And if you have a living being inside of you, if there's proof of life, then you're not allowed to kill it. That's the point of a heartbeat law. It's not to give you a 6-week window to get your abortion done before it becomes illegal. It's meant to find out as early as possible if there's proof of life. And Texas says, here's the reason why. Because once that life has been detected, the chances that it's going to develop normally and be born a healthy child are very high. In all probability, the second we can hear that fetal cardiac activity, we have a child that is going to make it. And so if that's what we have, the best understanding of what's now inside of the woman, then she is not allowed to contract an official to kill it, a doctor, nor is she allowed to procure medicine to take it and destroy it herself, because it is one of us. So it's a mischaracterization to call them 6-week bans, because that invites the kind of criticism that people are laying against it, as if the people in Georgia and Texas and Florida who crafted these laws weren't well aware of what they were trying to do. They are not 6 weeks bans. They are principled attacks against abortion in their communities. They're saying, we don't want you killing the unborn in our community. So as soon as we can detect a heartbeat, you're not allowed to destroy that life. You may disagree with it. You may not like it, but that's accurately what they're saying. That's why they don't call it a 6-week ban, because they're not giving you a 6-week window to get your abortion. They call it a heartbeat ban because they're saying the second we can determine life is there, we want to protect that life. And ACOG is saying, well, that's just not accurate, so call it a 6-week ban. And in so doing, you're absolutely muddying the water. That we've already done that with the fetal cardiac development and talked about that. I want to talk about this one for a second because partial birth abortion makes it on there. They said this graphic inflammatory language is not a medical term and exists to distort the clinical reality. It is vaguely defined in law, but is generally interpreted as referring to one method of abortion which occurs later in pregnancy. I invite anyone with a strong stomach to read the Gonzalez versus Carhart Supreme Court decision and tell me, I want you to read it from beginning to end and then get back with me if you think dilation and extraction is vaguely defined in the law. Not only is it horrifically and graphically described, so is the horrific and graphic alternative that's still legal. You can't perform this procedure, which they describe in detail, but you can perform this procedure, which they describe in detail. To call this vaguely defined in law is to indicate that you've just never read that decision at all, or you want to misrepresent what that is. And it says intact dilation and evacuation is the right term for what we're talking about. Intact, the child is intact. Dilation and evacuation, they tear the child to pieces while it's still inside the mother and take it out piece by piece. And that is the G-rated version of what these procedures do. Read Gonzalez versus Carhart. I challenge you to tell me whether you think it's vaguely described. So don't call it partial birth abortion, which it was. Intact dilation and evacuation requires you to deliver the baby breech up until its neck is out, because the head is the largest part of the body and the hardest part, and it's going to do the most damage to the woman coming out. And then take disgusting and graphic measures to make sure that that child's skull is not as large coming out as it was when you delivered the child up to its neck. It is partially born and then aborted. And it is clearly defined in Gonzalez versus Carhart what they're talking about. Not vaguely, clearly and graphically defined in great detail. So that's just dishonest. Post-birth abortion. No such procedure exists because abortion ends a pregnancy. It can only be performed during a pregnancy. Abortion cannot be performed after a pregnancy is ended. Use of this term dismisses the pain and suffering experienced by families in need of perinatal palliative care. Okay, I've never heard the term post-birth abortion. I have heard the term after-birth abortion in 2012. There was an article written in the Journal of Medical Ethics, which is not an obscure journal, which is a journal that's meant to help doctors to understand their moral duties and responsibilities to their patients. And in there, these two authors discuss the idea of after-birth abortions, saying that because abortion is acceptable, there may be some genetic abnormalities or problems that occur after a child has been born. And since nothing has changed substantively in the nature of the life since before it was born until after it was born, and since it's not consciously aware and not a person in the same term, if we can abort them there, let's just call it after-birth abortion. And that way, if something comes up that you didn't plan on happening, they can take it back to the doctors and have it painlessly and mercifully killed. And we'll just call it after-birth abortions, piggybacking on what's already accepted as abortion, and which is legal all the way up to 9 months, which they knew very well. So I have heard the term after-birth abortions, and I use that. Now, you may say, well, that was just one article, Jay. And you're right. That was just one article. That was so interesting to the readers and the public in general that they had a follow-up edition of the Journal of Medical Ethics in 2012 that was entirely devoted to after-birth abortions. And about half the people that wrote articles for it thought it was a good idea, or at least a reasonable idea, not unreasonable to consider. So let's not, again, they're acting like something doesn't exist that does. Womb. They don't like the term womb. This is a non-medical term that can be used to apply an emotional value to a human organ. You shouldn't be emotional about your human organs. So they say use the term uterus. All right. So here's another thing that I find fascinating as we tried to discuss, and we're reaching the end here on evaluation of them. Abortion on demand is a medical intervention. Abortion is a medical intervention provided to individuals who need to end the medical condition of pregnancy. Pregnancy is not just the way that every human being that has ever lived throughout all of human history has come into existence. It's a medical condition that may need treatment. And the medical condition of pregnancy, referring to it in this way, is dismissive of the medical needs. And here's where we get to my last discussion of pregnant people. Pregnant people. ACOG, who is so worried about being accurate and unbiased in how they tell people to talk about the issue of abortion and pregnancy, has one word missing from all of their guidelines. Can you guess what it is? JD has a guess. If you guessed woman, you're right. ACOG talks about the guidelines for talking about abortion and pregnancy, looking for accuracy, and manages to do it without ever once mentioning the word woman. So here's the things I'd like to say as we close this episode today. I think that an honest evaluation of ACOG standards will demonstrate that they are not unbiased in how they are approaching this. They are incredibly biased. And it comes through right from the beginning because they cast off, and even NPR's, I would say, more liberal understanding of how to use their words than most people use, because they don't call us at least anti-abortion. You want to talk about my rhetoric? Call it anti-abortion, call it pro-life, but they go to anti-choice because that has just the right negative ring to it to hit home the way they want it to hit. They call us, to say the least, biased, inaccurate, and not medically appropriate. I want to make sure anyone listening to this understands what I'm about to say. There are medical professionals every bit and more qualified than the members of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists who reject their view of abortion and the language that they use to talk about abortion. And what I find most irritating about them and the sort of slavish dedication to their language that you see oftentimes in reporters who are writing about abortion, who just, take these guidelines and run with them as if they were from the inspired word of God, is that they offer that from the pretense that they are somehow uniquely and especially qualified to tell you how doctors understand the issue versus you silly lay people that don't understand what you're talking about. And there are medical doctors, respected, successful, brilliant medical doctors who absolutely disagree with them and talk about abortion in an entirely different way than they do. And the idea that you would listen only to them versus those other medical professionals is the very definition of bias. So that is episode 6 of season 3. Elephants have names and ACOG is not unbiased. Next, we will be recording as fast as we can on the heels of this, discussing the plank in the Republican Party that has been removed and replaced with something far more troubling for those of us who see the value of human life as something that needs to be fought for and preserved. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting. If you like what you hear, if you hate what you hear, if you have money you wish to give us, please go to merelyhumanministries.org and contribute to this so that we continue to make this kind of material. Thank you so much and have a great day.